Good morning, everyone. My name is Carolyn Hart Bennett, and today I'm going to read from the third leg of the 5,000-mile journey that the Seven Sisters took from London, England to Salt Lake City. And the name of it is Seven Sisters, The Trek. Today I'm going to read chapter 40. Oblivious to all the excitement caused by the Indians, the teamsters drove the cattle slowly to the stream and feedlot. The cattle could hardly make it down the trail at first, but they seemed to sense water was waiting for them, and they plodded steadily to their reward. The captains of 10 were attentive to each of the families in their charge, helping them prepare for the night and announcing that after they had their supper, there would be a prayer meeting in the center of the circle. This announcement cheered the saints immensely. They longed for words of counsel and comfort after their trying day. Just the anticipation of the meeting was enough to bring a wave of renewed vigor to everyone. They quickly made their suppers and were grateful that they had clear, clean water for the first time in a week. After they cleaned up their suppers, they tried to wash the dust off their faces with the remaining water that was brought back from the stream. If there was any advantage of having to go to Fort Bridger, it was that there was clean water there, and seemingly lots of it. When they were all assembled, Captain MacArthur began. Brothers and sisters, I am truly sorry for the degradation and inconvenience of this day. But I am so thankful that your wonderful pioneer spirit prevailed, and you were cheerful and happy as you worked so hard to get the wagons and oxen up the formidable hill. Our trek today is just like obtaining the celestial kingdom. You see the goal ahead of you, you work hard to get there, you help each other so you can all make it there together, you endure to the end, and you have the Spirit with you. Brothers and sisters, I can proudly say you did all of these things today to reach the top of that hill. He continued his analogy. Satan's followers were there to taunt and torment you, hoping you would give up, but you didn't, and I'm so proud of you, just like the Lord is proud of you when you live your lives in such a way that you can return to Him. Just then, the gate of the fort swung open, and a delegation of soldiers led by Lieutenant Walker sauntered out and entered the wagon circle. They were laughing and not walking very straight. Lieutenant Walker moved through the saints to the center of the camp and announced in a slurred voice, Captain MacArthur, you and your company will receive your oath of allegiance tomorrow at 0800 hours. Be ready to report on time to the parade ground inside the fort. I also have the following letter to read to your company. To all Mormon wagon train companies passing Fort Bridger. If there are any in said company who are being taken to Salt Lake City against their will, particularly the young ladies, of whom we have received reports to this effect, the United States government offers asylum at Fort Bridger where you will be protected. The United States government also offers the men in the Mormon companies a choice of employment here at the fort, or to send them and their families back to the States free of expense. Then reading off the script, he added, we particularly want to invite the young ladies to join us, to take us up on this offer of asylum. One of the soldiers spoke up. Now's the time to get away from your Mormon bondage, sisters. We've got some spirits in the fort that some of you young ladies might like to drink with some of us fine soldiers. In fact, I dare say we are some of the finest soldiers in the United States Army. Captain MacArthur blurted out, if you are some of the finest soldiers, I'd hate to see some of the worst ones. Then he addressed the lieutenant. Sir, I can assure you that no one here is going to Salt Lake City against their will. But let it be known, if anyone wishes to go back to the States, they are at liberty to do so. And if any man or woman wishes to remain here, let them say so now. A short silence filled the night air. Then Marcus yelled, we will follow our captain. And the rest of the saints repeated the chant loudly. Captain MacArthur felt humbled and grateful. There, are you satisfied? Lieutenant Walker became agitated. Have it your way, but let me warn you Mormons about something. From here on out to Salt Lake City is the hardest part of your journey. Climbing that hill today was just a small taste of the treacherous climbs you will encounter as you go through the mountain passes ahead. And the place you're going is nothing more than a vast desert with a few sad homes, fences, and fields full of crickets and sagebrush. Captain Andrews burst out loudly. I say, give 3 cheers for the crickets and sagebrush. Hip, hip. And everyone everyone joined in on the hoorays with marked enthusiasm. Lieutenant Walker was disappointed that his plan to get some of the young ladies to come inside the fort hadn't worked. Well, it's your loss. Come on, man. About face. The soldiers put their right foot behind their left foot and tried to turn around. It didn't work very well, and one spun himself down to the ground. The others staggered to get their balance after turning and then went to help their chum. With some difficulty, the lieutenant marched them back inside the fort. Captain Larkin, we need to double the guards around the wagons tonight, said Captain MacArthur. Who knows what some of those soldiers might try. Now, brothers and sisters, let's sing a hymn and have a closing prayer. Then you can prepare for your night's rest. We want to be on time for our oath tomorrow morning. Then hopefully we can leave this den of vipers and backtrack to where we were yesterday. One consolation for tomorrow's journey, we will be traveling mostly downhill. The saints clapped gratefully and then became reverent for the closing song and beautiful prayer by Brother Jobson. The next morning at daybreak, the saints were awakened by the expert bugle player in the lookout tower. Everyone hustled to get ready for their oath of allegiance. The gates opened at 10 minutes to 8. After everyone was inside and assembled, the saints were expecting the commander of the fort to arrive and administer the oath. But who marched out to the beat of 2 parade drums? Lieutenant Walker, and the same officers who read the counterfeit letter the night before, the same ones who came to intercept them at Muddy Crossing. Captain MacArthur was astounded. Lieutenant Walker was the highest-ranking officer in the fort. He would administer the oath. Thankfully, he and his men looked a lot more sober this morning. Walker took his place on the platform, brought into the parade area for the purpose of the swearing in. All men over the age of 18 need to raise your right hands and say yes when I call for it. The men raised their hands as their wives and children looked on with pride. Citizens and or aliens of the Republic, do you solemnly swear you will remain loyal to the United States of America and never align yourselves with any group, state, or territory that plans to secede from the United States of America? The men yelled their answer, yes, so loudly that it startled the soldiers, and some held their heads in pain from the hangover they were nursing after drinking so much the night before. If you will all line up at those 3 tables and sign your oaths, you will be finished here. The women started to chatter softly as the men got into the lines that were forming. After the men and the boys signed their papers, their families milled around for a few minutes, examining the inside of the fort. It had a large parade area in the center, with a dozen or so buildings that included officers' quarters, soldiers' barracks, a mess hall, an ammunition and firearms storage, a dispensary, a blacksmith shop, and a guardhouse. There were portholes the height of a man's shoulder all along the 18-foot-high walls, so the soldiers could shoot through them and be shielded from returning fire. After he signed his oath, Captain MacArthur looked for Lieutenant Walker. He had a few more things to say to him. Lieutenant, I demand to talk to the commanding officer here at Fort Bridger. I'm sorry, but he went to Ham's Fort yesterday to meet the Mormon wagon trains that will be following you. He will administer their oaths there. I'm in charge in his absence. You mean to tell me that you are the officer in charge, and you dragged us across the country like prisoners taken in arms just to do what you had us do here today? And you could have very well administered this same oath at Muddy Crossing and had us sign the oath there? Yeah, I could have, he said, smiling smugly. Your treatment of us, Lieutenant, is reprehensible. I don't have words to tell you what a poor excuse of a human being I think you are, and your men are just as despicable. Here's my written protest and a demand for $500 compensation for our time and trouble yesterday and today. He handed the lieutenant the paper and climbed the platform. Brothers and sisters, we will be heading out of our camp in 30 minutes. No need to sign and run, folks, yelled one soldier as the rest laughed scornfully. Then, to add salt to the wound, Lieutenant Walker ceremoniously held the protest paper up high and tore it in half. When Captain MacArthur saw this display of disrespect, he uttered some swear words the saints had never heard before, causing the women to gasp and cover the ears of their children. What does that mean, Susanna? Asked the twins. Never you mind, twinsies. Those are words I don't approve of for your vocabulary study. Let's move, yelled Captain MacArthur, who thought the Saints weren't leaving fast enough. Everyone could see how angry he was, and in 2 minutes flat, the fort was evacuated, and remarkably, the Dixie train was back on the road with 10 minutes to spare. The oxen seemed tremendously revived after drinking, eating, and resting all night. They moved down the road at a much faster pace than they came up to the fort. Still, the teamsters had to put lock chains on their wheels of the wagons as they descended the one hill that had been so troublesome for the climb the day before. Not having to double-team the oxen on the hill cut their time there to less than an hour, and they arrived back at Muddy Crossing in the early afternoon. The scouters had ridden ahead and found a much better place to camp than they found the last time they were there. The place was by a little tributary that would water their cattle nicely, and with their new supply of flour, they could happily make some bread that wouldn't taste gritty. The captains assured the Saints that water and food wouldn't be a problem for the rest of the trek through the mountains. That was the best news they had received in a long time. Later that evening at the camp prayer meeting, Captain MacArthur took his customary place in front of the Saints. But he didn't seem to be his usual confident self as he looked down at his feet and kicked aimlessly at the dirt. Tonight I want to apologize to all you brothers and sisters for what happened today and yesterday at Fort Bridger, for losing my temper with those derelict soldiers, and especially for any cursing anyone overheard me utter in my frustration. There's a little history with me in Fort Bridger. It is a place that just automatically riles my dander. Captain Andrews knows what I mean, because he and I spent some unsought-for time there just a few years ago. I'm going to tell you about it, and he can chime in if he thinks I'm not telling the story straight. You know I will, Captain, said Andrews. First, I'm going to tell you a little history about the fort. Jim Bridger and his partner, Luis Vasquez, built the place out of heavy green cottonwood to be a trading post in 1843. There they kept supplies for trappers and hunters and wagon trains that passed by. This was before it belonged to the federal government. Jim was a famous shot, an agile runner, a wrestler, a storyteller, and was both loved and feared by the Indians. Captain Andrews stepped forward to add his commentary. In fact, he lived there with 2 squaws whom he called by his pet names, Damn Your Eyes and Blast Your Eyes. The Saints chuckled nervously at Andrews' swearing. Captain MacArthur rolled his eyes and continued. Yes, and together they raised 2 nice families. Bridger scouted and trapped a lot of the Rocky Mountain region and was one of the first to ever see the Salt Lake Valley. In fact, he counseled with President Young in 1847 about whether it was an appropriate place to take the displaced Mormons. During that meeting, near the mouth of the Little Sandy River, Bridger drew a map on the ground for President Young, depicting the region in great detail. Then he conveyed his misgivings regarding the agricultural productivity of the Salt Lake area. He offered President Young $1,000 for the first bushel of corn that could be raised there. I wonder if he's ever collected on that offer, said Captain Andrews, because there have been hundreds of bushels of corn raised in the valley since that time. The Saints chuckled with pride. Captain MacArthur went on. This first meeting between the Mormons and Bridger appeared to have been pleasant, yet this relationship became a bittersweet one for Bridger. After the first Mormon wagon trains used Fort Bridger for a while, and the Saints started to prosper in the valley, they decided to build Fort Supply near Fort Bridger, which pulled away a lot of Bridger's trade, including that of the Indians. This caused economic hardship for Bridger. Animosity between him and the Mormons festered in the summer of 1853. Mormon leaders were convinced that Bridger was engaged in illicit trade with the Indians, especially guns and ammunition, and that he had stirred hostility among the Indians against the Mormons. Andrews piped up. The Mormons revoked Bridger's license to trade and issued a warrant for his arrest, but before the posse arrived, Bridger fled. The church took steps to purchase the fort from Jim's partner, Vasquez. Meanwhile, the United States Congress got a burr under its saddle about the Mormons in Utah Territory. Captain MacArthur began to question who was telling the story here. He looked perturbed. Oh, sorry, Cap. Go on, said Andrews. MacArthur got serious again. The government received reports that the Mormons were becoming a threat because they were growing and thriving too much, and they might try to secede from the United States, like the South did, to establish their own separate kingdom in Utah. Under political pressure, President Buchanan decided to send 2,500 United States troops to Utah to put down what he supposed was an insurrection by the Mormons. The troops were also to provide safe passage for a new governor to take Brigham Young's place. The listening saints began to murmur among themselves and held on to each other's hands, marveling that they had never heard this part of the church's history before. Sending 2,500 government-trained, fully armed troops to Utah would mean a massacre of the Latter-day Saints. That was the beginning of the so-called Utah War just 5 years ago. Lavinia was disbelieving. They had a war in Utah 5 years ago? Shh, Caroline whispered. Let's hear some more. Then the prophet got word from Porter Rockwell and A.O. Smoot that the United States Army had been given orders to put down the so-called rebellion in Utah. Eleanor was surprised that A.O. Smoot's name came up. President Smoot had been so instrumental in helping the Saints when the Saluda blew up. He was probably still back in Lexington with President Tippett, helping with the dead and wounded from that horrible explosion. And now his name had come up as one of the two who brought the news to the prophet, warning him the Army of the United States was poised to march to Utah. He definitely got around. Andrews interrupted her thoughts. They accused us of everything they could lay their tongue to: treason, battery, perversion of the law, theft, and fraud. The only thing they left unclear was whether or not the Mormons habitually kicked their dogs. The company burst out laughing for a few moments and then quieted down when MacArthur took over. How can a people who do not get drunk, do not profane the name of God, who are honest and upright in all their dealings, who marry their wives and support them, who educate their children and teach them to fear God, who look upon marriage, the marriage vow, as being the most sacred of earthly ties, and who prize virtue more than life, be so corrupt? The saints nodded their agreement. Captain Andrews interjected. I was in the meeting when President Young received the word, and I heard him say, "The constant cry is kill the Mormons. Well, let them try. Why, I've got enough wives to whip them all." The saints guffawed loudly. Captain Andrews knew no bounds. Captain MacArthur went on. President Young's next edict put fear into everyone because he asked the 30,000 saints in Salt Lake City to prepare to evacuate the city and go south to escape the advance of Johnston's army. He told us all to stockpile food and feed for our stock. Guns were manufactured and ammunition cast. All our missionaries were called home. He was looking at the prospects of a full-scale war with the U.S. Army and was taking the threat of possible extinction very seriously. Andrews stepped in. If total war became inevitable, an alliance with the native Indians was central to Young's strategy. He figured the Indians needed to learn to help us, or the United States Army would kill us both. MacArthur was getting used to Andrews' interruptions by now and was starting to welcome them. He continued. President Young hoped to keep Johnston's army out of the Utah Territory without resorting to bloodshed. He gathered the Nauvoo Legion, of which we too were members, and told us to ascertain the locality or route of the troops and to proceed at once to annoy them in every way possible, to stampede or drive their animals away, burn the whole country before them on their flanks, take no life, but destroy their trains. So that's exactly what we did. Captain Andrews and I were among the men sent to make sure Fort Bridger wasn't a fit place to house the U.S. Army. Andrews announced bluntly, "So we burned down both Fort Bridger and Fort Supply." The saints looked at each other, surprised President Young would order the church's own forts to be burned down. Then the two of us went with Lot Smith and the Mormon cavalry on a rather dangerous assignment, where we burned 52 supply wagons belonging to the government outfitters that were bringing replacement supplies to the Army. As a result, we destroyed 300,000 pounds of food and liberated their horses and cattle, which we took back west with us. Do you remember seeing that circle of black charred remains and scattered ox bows and metal wheel bands off to the right in that little valley about 3 miles east of Big Sandy Crossing, said Captain Andrews. I'm not saying for sure, but that looks like some of our handiwork. The men thoroughly enjoyed hearing about all these daring escapades, but the women worried about the danger involved. Andrews continued, the Army was growing tired of our constant harassment throughout the fall. At one point, they mounted roughly 100 men on army mules to combat the Mormon militia. This jackass cavalry, as we dubbed it, had a run-in with us and fired at us, but no one got killed. I took a bullet through my hat, though. He laughed as he took off his hat. See, he said, sticking his finger through the forefinger through the hole and wiggling it. Peals of laughter came from the children. It was Captain MacArthur's turn. President Young sent others to make sure the route through Echo Canyon would be a death trap for the large body of troops. President Young also gave the order for 1,000 additional volunteers from the Nauvoo Legion to be placed in the 100 miles of mountains where the troops might enter the Salt Lake Valley. There they built fortifications, stacked rocks to be flung down, dug rifle pits, cut down cedar trees and burned the trunks to look like cannons from a distance, and dammed streams and rivers so they could flood the canyon floor, all in preparation for a possible battle. So it would look like there were a lot more soldiers than there were. They marched the men in circles around the top of the rocks. Captain Andrews added, in the end, the soldiers decided not to enter Utah through Echo Canyon. They decided to enter from the north along the Bear River. All that work for nothing. But when we get to Echo Canyon, you can still see the fortifications. MacArthur forged on. President Young's next move was to declare martial law, forbidding any armed forces from coming into Utah territory under any pretense whatsoever. President Young's plans seemed drastic, but he wasn't going to let our properties and possessions fall into the hands of usurpers ever again. And you won't believe this, Andrews added sarcastically, but Johnston's army was guided by none other than Jim Bridger. He was helping the army, said Aunt Lucy to Eleanor. What a scoundrel. When the evacuation began, the roads were crowded with thousands of saints moving south. President Young appointed Minutemen who were to carry out his most drastic order yet, his scorched earth policy, where they waited for his signal to burn houses, buildings, and crops before they would let them be taken by the government. They burned down all the houses in the valley, whispered Susanna tearfully. What are we getting ourselves into, sisters? And what about the temple, Lavinia asked Caroline. I read in the Star just before we left England that the foundation was up several feet. Captain Andrews must have overheard Lavinia's remark, because his next sentence addressed her question. He ordered men to cache all the stone that was cut for the Salt Lake Temple and cover the foundation to make it look like a plowed field. I heard President Young make this statement. We'll burn Salt Lake City down if there's one shot fired by federal troops. The parents began wondering if their children should be hearing these things. This information certainly didn't lend itself to peace of mind or a feeling of security and protection in this new place where they would be building their homes and raising their families. Then the tide of the story changed. I can see many of you parents are worried about what we've been telling you, said Captain MacArthur. But here's the good news. God watches out for his church, and the Johnston army was stopped by a heavy blizzard in late October. He had to settle his troops into ill-equipped winter camps near the burned-out remains of Fort Bridger. There, Johnston waited resupply and reinforcements. He would prepare to attack the Mormons' positions after the spring thaw. Fortunately, the lull in hostilities during the winter months provided an opportunity for negotiations, and Thomas L. Kane of Pennsylvania, who helped the church obtain a deal with the government to create the Mormon Battalion, was asked by President Young to again mediate between the Mormons and the federal government. President Buchanan sent an official peace commission to Utah and offered a free pardon to all the Mormons for any acts incident to the conflict, if they would submit to governmental authority. This included permitting Johnston's army into the territory. He further assured the Mormons that the U.S. government would not interfere with our religion, and once the new governor was installed and the laws yielded to, there would be no more necessity to retain any portion of the army in the territory except what would be needed to keep the Indians in line and protect the passage of immigrants to California. In the end, the results were a full pardon for the Mormons, a transfer of Utah's governorship to Alfred Cumming, a non-Mormon, and the peaceful entrance of the United States Army into Utah. President Young accepted Buchanan's terms and pardon, although he denied Utah had ever rebelled against the United States. Captain Andrews dug down in his pouch. "I've got a newspaper clipping I like to keep just to remind me of the government's stupidity. It's from the New York Herald. It reads, 'Thus was peace made. Thus ended the Mormon War. Killed none, wounded none, fooled everybody.'" The Saints smiled happily. They were finally satisfied that they weren't traveling into a burned-out, war-torn city. "Here are just a few side notes," said MacArthur. "At the end of June, the Army troops under General Johnston entered the Salt Lake Valley unhindered and rode through the empty streets of Salt Lake City. Johnston was heard to say that he would have given his whole plantation for a chance to bombard the city for 15 minutes. Andrews couldn't resist. His second in command, Lieutenant Colonel Charles Ferguson Smith, stated that he didn't care who heard him. He would like to see every damn Mormon hung by the neck. That just goes to show you the United States Army was not our friend. "There goes your mouth again, Captain." "Not my mouth, Cap," he defended. "Lieutenant Colonel Smith's mouth. I was just quoting." When the laughter died down, Captain MacArthur resumed. "More good news. In early July, the Saints began to return to their homes after it was clear no more reinforcements were being sent to Utah. Johnston's army settled in Camp Floyd, 50 miles south of Salt Lake City. That was in 57. You'll be glad to learn there is no conflict in Utah Territory today. Things are back to normal. Chattering, clapping, and sighs of relief were heard throughout the congregation. "We hardly have any U.S. troops in Utah now," said Andrews, "because most of them have been called back east to serve in the Civil War. The Utah War has become an embarrassment for President Buchanan and will forever be attached to his name as Buchanan's blunder. Our history is strewn with persecution and injustices," concluded Captain MacArthur, "but the Lord is watching over his church, and in this case, he saved his saints from probable destruction. Now that you know how the story ended, I think you have been sitting far too long and we need to get some blood circulating. If the band will begin playing, we can have a few dances before we settle down for the night." Captain Andrews shouted, "Let's have 3 cheers for the band." That's the end of chapter 40. Over and out.